Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. Something a little bit different today. I was away for a few days this week. Obviously, the world's been in lockdown. In New Zealand, some of the restrictions have been lifting. So I managed to get away for a few days. No internet, no nothing. And it was some glorious fishing on Lake Taupo. So see here on screen, this is the sort of vista that I had. And the fishing was, it was okay. Didn't get boatloads of fish, but the stuff that we caught was good. Like great condition fish. And here's a little bit of evidence of that. This is some of the smoked trout. So yeah, really enjoyed it. But on my return, one of the first things I saw was the Tyson Fury and Dillian Whyte thing. So I did a video on that. And then I obviously had to go back the last few days just to see, well, what's been going on. So there was a number of things that caught my eye that I just wanted to wade in on, some comments. So it's not so much a news video, more sort of my response and reaction to some things that have been going on. One thing that I thought was quite interesting was this graphic that I saw DAZN on Instagram post, and it was a quote from Eddie Hearn, who talked to Chris Mannix. So he said, "We've got to come back with a schedule that sports fans like. We can't afford weak fights anymore." Eddie Hearn talking to Chris Mannix of DAZN. So that sort of struck me because recently Barry Hearn had said something similar, that he said there needed to be more 50-50 fights, and I sort of, shrugged my shoulders a little bit, thinking, are we really going to get that? But then you have Eddie Hearn saying something similar, but also we can't afford any more weak fights. But can we interpret that to be that, and we probably can, that promoters were serving us up, a lot of fights that fans didn't actually want, that we were getting too many mismatches, too many fights we didn't care about, because that's part of the problem in boxing. And I think that's part of the issue, that, it has remained to some extent a niche sport. You're not getting good enough fights often enough. And that sort of statement, we can't afford weak fights anymore, sort of typifies the sort of modus operandi that promoters had before. You might have a card and it's got one good fight on it, and then the rest you don't really care for. It just feels like it's all filler. And if anything can come out of this lockdown, if there is more competitive fights, and it is going to be something that's going to captivate the boxing fan and maybe some casual fans to become sort of more hardcore boxing fans, for me, that would be a great thing. But I remain a little bit skeptical, because they're boxing promoters after all, kind of like politicians. Their lips are moving. They're probably lying. So I'm, sort of waiting with bated breath to see what we really get offered up, because I'm expecting there's still going to be quite a few tune-ups, because a lot of guys wouldn't have had a lot of good preparation leading up to whenever they first fight. So we'll see. We'll see. There was some quotes from Anthony Joshua to British GQ. So there's a couple. Of the first one, he says, of a Tyson Fury fight, "I'm here to make history. I'm fired up. Fury's just another opponent at the end of the day. I'm looking at Fury like he's just another fighter. In terms of spectacle, trash talking, two juggernauts coming together, I can't wait." I like the sound of that. I think fans like the sound of that. We want that fight. But it is one of these things with potential obstacles in the way. I would prefer that the fighters themselves, to some extent, kind of sort of actually sway away from this, and more sort of, we can talk about that fight when we get there. Because look, guys like Joshua have been talking about Undisputed for 3 years. We haven't had it for a myriad of reasons. And you can't just blame one fighter or another. It's generally a confluence of factors that have led to the fight not happening. And obviously money is a key part of it. But right now, it doesn't seem to be money so much. It's more that they've just got guys in front of them that they have to fight before they could even come together. No guarantees that they will continue to win and eventually square off for an undisputed fight. I could totally see Joshua and Fury fighting at some point. Maybe it just won't be undisputed though. And there was another quote where he said, and this is of his loss to Andy Ruiz Jr., and this was quite curious, because he said, I got beaten to a pulp and had to pull myself back together. Now they're going to see the rebirth of me. Everyone writes me off in this division, but I believe I will go down as this generation's great. That's what I'm destined to do. There's a couple of things to sort of pull apart from that quote. The fact that he says he got beaten to a pulp, that is certainly different rhetoric that he was using ahead of the Ruiz rematch, where he was putting it down to a lucky punch. It was a punch from the gods. But now he's saying he got beaten to a pulp. And people will have seen that and been like, well, hang on, that's a little bit different to what he said before. But I sort of thought, well, perhaps this is more about perspective, because he's beaten Ruiz Jr. That's behind him now. Maybe he could be honest with himself and sort of go, yeah, I did get beaten up in that first fight, because ultimately that's what happened. But the whole beaten to a pulp, I hadn't heard that before. But the other part of that, everyone writes me off in this division. See, I don't know if that's completely true. Maybe this is more of him trying to, as part of his sort of psychology and trying to fuel his own fire for fights to come. He's trying to have a chip on his shoulder, because I think he proved a lot of doubters wrong after that rematch against Andy Ruiz Jr. But Joshua is still a dangerous fighter, and he's going to have a lot of good wins against good competition in the division. And I think, we can't write him off against anyone that he faces. But I think to say that everyone writes him off, that's a massive stretch. And I think it's probably more he's using, as he perceives it, to motivate him going forward. Moving on, Deontay Wilder, he emerged on social media after a full month away. His last appearance was in April, pretty much 1 month to the day, and he had spoken to PBC, the podcast that they have, saying that he was rehabbing his bicep injury and he expected to be sparring by late May. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out in the next week or two, what sort of stuff he'll be posting and where his sort of health is at, because obviously that's a question right now. Another surgery, obviously he's had a whole bundle, in his career. What about 10 or a dozen or so by now? He's obviously had a lot of issues with the right hand, the right arm, but also he's had a few left arm injuries more recently too. Picked one up in the Brazil injury, and that bicep injury, I believe, was also the left arm. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with him and his health, because I think it is one of the things that people often forget about, that Wilder is a guy who relies on athleticism as part of what he does. And if he's starting to break down and be even more injury prone, his prime could end quicker than people think, but we'll see. So Eddie Hearn, he's been talking about the Joshua and Pulev fight that they'd like to do in the UK, but it just may not be possible. So he said, wouldn't it be great to come through all this, stage a world heavyweight title fight in the UK this year? For us, that's an absolute focus, and that's taken out of our hands. We'll look at other options around the world. And I guess that just may be something that they have to do. If they can't have a crowd, which is something they seemingly want, because the gate obviously is a decent chunk of the revenue raised for a Joshua fight. And he says that they're looking at Croatia. It's a potential option at this stage, just part of a wider discussion, given the current uncertainty. I'd expect to see him in the ring at the end of September at the earliest, but more likely October or November as the restrictions hopefully start to ease. And I guess my thoughts on this one is Kubrat Pulev, Anthony Joshua, compared to some other fights that Joshua could be in. This is sort of one that I think you can get away with having outside of the UK, because the interest isn't as strong in that one. And that's no disrespect to Kubrat Pulev, but it's just a reality of the situation. He's a name in the division, but he's not one of the biggest names, and he obviously has ambitions of taking the title. But I think this is one of these fights that if you had it in Croatia, I think people would be okay with that, as opposed to, say, if it was a Dillian Whyte or a Tyson Fury type matchup. They'd want that back in the UK or in primetime, whatever. Okay, moving on. So Frank Warren is saying that Daniel Dubois versus Joyce, which was originally scheduled for April, then rescheduled for July. They're now looking at September or October, and Frank Warren is hoping that fans will be allowed. And if not, because remember that was going to be on pay-per-view, and I'm sure the gate would have been a big part of the revenue stream there for Frank Warren. He said that interim bouts behind closed doors could also be considered, and bigger fights may happen behind closed doors if restrictions continue long term. And that's a pragmatic approach, because at some point you're just going to have to pull the trigger. And I guess it's that conversation at the moment that fighters won't be wanting to have, some of these bigger name fighters that, they may have had certain expectations with a live gate, pay-per-view, etc., what they're going to get paid. But if restrictions continue, say, for the next year, then they may just have to take a haircut on the pay and just be fine with that. And I think some of the guys that are going to gain some more sort of traction with fans will be some of those bigger fighters that come back and voluntarily actually take a bit of a pay cut just because they realize that if they want to resume their careers, that may be something that they just have to do. And ultimately, some of those guys who come back early, they might end up having a boost in their career from that, because we all want to see big time boxing, not just the sort of middle of the road guys who'll be in good fights, and there is that place for it and we'll enjoy it, but they're not the big fights. Some of these big names, I mean, they may just engender themselves to fans more if they come back and actually leave some money on the table, just because that money, it may not actually be on the table anymore. It's just not there anymore. I have heard some fighters, I mean, Terence Crawford, for example, saying, look, if there's no crowd, you need to pay me more. But it may not be that sort of environment anymore, that the sort of money and the purses that fighters had been expecting may not exist in the form that they once did. And we'll just round out the video with this: Derek Chisora volunteering to go spar Alexander Povetkin ahead of Povetkin's fight with Dillian Whyte, which they're talking about maybe August. And Chisora himself, he had been scheduled to fight Alexander Usyk. That's still sort of TBA when that's going to be rescheduled for. But I guess it benefits a couple of reasons for him. One, if he spars Alexander Povetkin, it's a bit of money in the door too. But two, he can get some good sparring too for whenever he is going to be facing Alexander Usyk. And Alexander Povetkin and Alexander Usyk, somewhat similar, in stature. Maybe, Usyk is a bit sort of bigger than Povetkin, but in terms of having a sparring partner, a skilled guy, it's not too far away. So I kind of like that for Derek Chisora in terms of a guy that he can get some benefit from, a tough guy, a really good heavyweight. And I know some people will be, thinking, oh, well, why is he going to go help Povetkin try to, beat White sort of thing? But it is, boxing after all. These guys get paid for a living, sparring, that sort of thing. I think some of the patriotic aspect of it, you just have to sort of check that at the door, because it's a business after all, and these guys are after paydays and they're after advantages for themselves. It is an individual sport after all. What does Derek Chisora owe Dillian Whyte? Nothing. Anyway, that's the sort of couple of things I'd seen that I wanted to comment on. So drop a comment loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe, follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.